Margaret Foster stood on the scales outside Henderson's general store, her face burning with shame as the Jurgen swung past 250 pounds. The crowd that had gathered wasn't there to help her buy flour or coffee. They were there to witness her humiliation. 15 pounds more than last month, shouted Jim Cooper, the town drunk who had appointed himself chronicler of Margaret's weight fluctuations. Soon you'll need your own scale. The laughter cut through her like winter wind. Margaret had been the town's favorite target since arriving 3 years ago as a mail-order bride, only to be abandoned when her groom saw her genuine photograph instead of the flattering portrait she had sent. Margaret, called out Mrs. Peterson, the town busybody who organized these degrading weigh-ins. Maybe if you ate less, Mr. Cooper would take you seriously. But Margaret was done being the butt of jokes. She stepped off the scales, pulled up her dress to its proper height, and walked through the crowd of snickering townspeople with her head held high. "You want to laugh?" she said, her voice carrying clearly across the street. "Fine. Laugh today. But remember this. I am more than the number on a scale." The crowd fell silent, not because they were impressed, but because something in Margaret's tone suggested they were about to witness something they might regret. Jacob Big Jake Morrison had been watching from his horse as the weigh-in unfolded, his 6'8" frame casting a shadow across the street. He was the largest man in 3 territories, and his ranch stretched over 10,000 acres of prime Wyoming grassland. But what made him remarkable wasn't his size, it was what he had done with it. Every desperate widow, every child without parents, every soul cast out by this community had found shelter and employment on his spread. He had a rule. Anyone who was willing to work hard earned their keep, regardless of their appearance, age, or circumstances. Margaret Foster had been the one person he had wanted to help, but she had always refused his offers of employment. "I'm too ashamed," she had told him once. "I don't want people to think you're giving me charity because you feel sorry for me." But seeing her face today, the way her back was straight despite the laughter, something in Jake Morrison's heart shifted. This was not a woman who needed pity. This was a woman who needed someone to see her worth. He dismounted from his horse, the movement carrying the weight of decision. When he reached Margaret, he took off his hat and held it over his heart in the old style. "Miss Foster?" he said, his voice carrying easily over the crowd. "Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" The silence that followed was absolute. Then someone started laughing, and the laughter spread like wildfire through the crowd. "Big Jake Morrison wants to marry a whale," hooted Jim Cooper. "That's the funniest thing I've heard all week." But Margaret looked into Jake's eyes and saw something there that made her heart race. He wasn't joking. He was completely serious. "Why?" Margaret asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because you're the strongest person I know," Jake replied, not bothering to lower his voice for the crowd. "You've stood here every month for 3 years and let them weigh you like cattle, not because you couldn't leave, but because you chose to face your fears. That takes more courage than any man in this town possesses." The crowd's laughter faltered, and Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Respect. Not pity, not mockery, but genuine admiration from a man whose opinion mattered. "Plus," Jake added with a slight smile, "I've been watching you work at the boarding house. The way you lift sacks of flour that would strain the backs of most men, the way you feed the hungry without judgment, the way you keep your dignity even when the world tries to strip it from you. That's the kind of woman I want to raise children with." Margaret felt tears stinging her eyes. No one had ever described her in terms of her strength before. "I weigh 312 pounds, she said quietly. "I'm ugly, I'm slow, and the town makes fun of me every day. Why would you want that?" Jake's laugh was warm and genuine. Because I want a partner, not a decoration. Because I want someone who won't be afraid to tell me when I'm wrong. Because I want someone who understands what it means to be judged by appearance alone and chooses to be better than the judges. He took a step closer, his presence both intimidating and protective. And because I think you might be the most beautiful woman in this territory, and that beauty has nothing to do with your size. The news spread faster than wildfire. By evening, it had reached every ranch house within 50 miles. Big Jake Morrison, the wealthiest and most respected man in the territory, was going to marry Margaret Foster, the town fat girl. The reactions were predictable. Some thought Jake was having a mental breakdown. Others suspected he was secretly cruel and wanted to humiliation Margaret publicly before destroying her. A few, the wise ones, began to wonder if they had been wrong about both the bride and the groom. At the boarding house where Margaret worked, the other women watched her with new eyes. "You should be careful," warned her boss, Mrs. Henderson. "Men like Morrison don't really want women like us. They want to prove something, and you'll be the one who pays the price when he realizes what he's done." But Margaret was done listening to people who had never believed in her. She had seen something in Jake Morrison's eyes that convinced her he was sincere, and she was going to trust that instinct. The next morning, Jake appeared at the boarding house with a bouquet of wildflowers he had picked himself and a proposal ring that he had been saving for the right woman. "Margaret Foster," he said, dropping to one knee in the dusty street. "Will you marry me and help me run the biggest, most successful ranch in the territory? Because I think we can do this together, and I think we can do it better than anyone else has ever done it." This time there was no laughter. Even the cynics had to admit that the man was genuine in his intentions. The wedding took place at Morrison's ranch, and it was attended by every person in 3 counties. Not because they were invited, but because everyone wanted to see what would happen when the giant rancher married the fat girl. Margaret arrived in a white dress that Jake had ordered especially for her from St. Louis. It was made of the finest silk, with lace that had been embroidered by hand. But the dress wasn't what made her beautiful that day. It was the way she held herself, the confidence that radiated from her every movement. "You look radiant," Jake told her as they stood before the preacher. "You look like the woman I fell in love with." "I love you," Margaret whispered, the words carrying all the weight of her heart. "I love you for seeing me." The ceremony was simple, but profound. When it came time for the vows, Jake spoke first. "I promise to see you as you are, not as others think you should be," he said. "I promise to stand with you against anyone who would try to shame you for your size, your strength, or your worth. I promise to help you build a life that proves every person deserves love, respect, and the chance to be their true self." When Margaret spoke, her voice carried across the crowd with perfect clarity. "I promise to work as hard as you do, to love as fully as you love, and to never let anyone make you feel like you need to hide your kindness or compromise your principles. I promise to be the partner you deserve." They kissed as the sun set behind the mountains, and even the skeptics had to admit that there was something real and powerful about their union. Their wedding night was different from what either had expected. Instead of a private romantic evening, they found themselves in the ranch house kitchen, preparing food for the workers who had stayed late to celebrate. "Being married means being partners," Jake explained, handing her a knife to start cutting vegetables. "And partners share the work, the meals, and the daily life. Tonight, we feed our people." Margaret found herself smiling as they worked side by side. This was what marriage should be. Not a man taking care of a woman, but 2 people taking care of each other and their community. As the evening progressed, they talked about their dreams for the ranch, their plans for the future, and their shared vision of creating a place where no one would be judged for their differences. "I want to start a school," Margaret said as they cleaned up after dinner. "For children who don't fit the normal schools. Kids who are too big, too small, too different. Every child deserves an education, regardless of what they look like. Jake's smile was radiant. We'll need more teachers, more supplies, more buildings. It's a big project. We can do big projects, Margaret replied. We're both good at that. When they finally retired to their bedroom, they lay together without any pretense or embarrassment. Margaret had expected to be self-conscious, but Jake's presence was so warm and accepting that she felt completely at ease. "I love you," Jake whispered, and Margaret knew that she had found exactly what she had always wanted, someone who loved her for being herself, without reservation or condition. The first year of their marriage was a whirlwind of activity and growth. Margaret proved to be an exceptional business partner, her keen eye for detail, and her understanding of what it meant to be underestimated, making her invaluable in negotiations and management. Together, they expanded the ranch to 15,000 acres, added a dairy operation, and established the school Margaret had dreamed of. But more importantly, they began to attract other couples who had been marginalized by their communities, people who were different in some way, and had been made to feel worthless. The Morrison Ranch became a haven for those seeking a fresh start, and the townspeople who had once mocked Margaret found themselves looking for ways to apologize without actually admitting they had been wrong. "Look what the fat girl has accomplished," Mrs. Peterson grudgingly admitted to her friends. "I guess Big Jake knew something the rest of us didn't." But Margaret wasn't interested in rubbing their faces in their mistakes. She was too busy building a life and a legacy that would make the world a better place for people like herself. The school was her proudest achievement. Children who had been excluded from regular schools because they were too big, too small, too slow, or too different found a place where their unique qualities were seen as assets rather than liabilities. Margaret's own story became a source of inspiration for children who thought they would never be accepted for who they were. By their 3rd anniversary, Margaret and Jake had adopted 3 children who had nowhere else to go. Tommy was a 7-year-old boy who was already taller than most adults. Mary was a 5-year-old girl who was smaller than children half her age. And Billy was a 10-year-old who had been kicked out of 3 schools for being too aggressive. "They're all perfect," Margaret told Jake one evening as they tucked the children into bed. "Each one special in their own way, exactly the way they should be." The children had been initially surprised to find that their new mother was so different from the idealized women in storybooks, but they had quickly learned that real love wasn't about appearance. It was about how you treated people and how much you cared. "I like having a big mama," Tommy announced one day. "She can pick me up and swing me around, and her hugs are the best in the world." "I like that she makes us feel normal," added Mary. "Not like we need to be different to be good enough." Their family was becoming a legend throughout the territory, not because they were unusual, but because they were so perfectly normal despite their differences. The Morrison children were confident, well-educated, and deeply loved, regardless of their physical characteristics. 5 years after their marriage, Margaret and Jake faced the ultimate test of their love and commitment. A severe drought struck the territory, and many ranches were forced to sell their cattle or go bankrupt. The Morrison Ranch, managed jointly by 2 people who had learned to turn their differences into strengths, not only survived, but thrived. Margaret's keen eye for business had diversified their operations, while Jake's strength and reputation had secured them the best water rights and grazing permits. Together, they not only kept their own ranch solvent, but helped other families weather the crisis. The town that had once mocked Margaret for her size now came to her for advice and assistance. She became the unofficial mayor of the territory, respected for her wisdom, her fairness, and her ability to see solutions where others saw only problems. "Margaret Morrison," said Dr. Jameson, the territory's only physician, "you've built something remarkable here, a community where people can be themselves and succeed." "It wasn't hard," Margaret replied. "All I did was treat people the way I wanted to be treated, with respect, kindness, and the assumption that they had value regardless of what they looked like." The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The woman the town had weighed like cattle had become the most valuable person in the territory. 10 years after their wedding day, Margaret and Jake stood together on the porch of their ranch house, watching their children play in the yard. The school had expanded to include children from across 3 territories, and the Morrison Ranch had become a model for how different people could work together to build something beautiful. "Look how far we've come," Margaret said, leaning against Jake's side. "Look how far you've come," Jake corrected gently. "You were always strong and beautiful. I just helped you see it." Margaret smiled, thinking about the young woman who had once stood on scales and let people laugh at her weight. That woman would never have imagined that her worth would eventually be measured not by what she weighed, but by what she accomplished and how many lives she touched. "The giant rancher married the obese bride," she said softly, "and they lived happily ever after." Jake's laugh was warm in the evening air. They didn't just live happily. They lived purposefully. They lived in a way that made the world better for everyone who came after them. Their story had indeed become legend, but not for the reasons the original crowd had expected. It wasn't a story of a man settling for less than he deserved. It was a story of 2 people who had found their perfect match and built a life that proved love really could conquer anything, even a community's cruelty and a person's own self-doubt. And in the growing darkness of the Wyoming plains, with the sound of happy children and the lights of their thriving community gleaming in the distance, Margaret and Jake Morrison knew that they had created something that would outlast them both. Proof that everyone deserves love, everyone has value, and sometimes the most unlikely pairings create the most beautiful love stories. If this story touched your spirit, share it so that the voices of the ancestors are never forgotten. Like and subscribe to Native American Tales, where every time we bring you another cinematic legend, where pain meets purpose,